In the winter of 1959, 10 Russian hikers set out on a 200-mile, 16-day trek into the Ural Mountains along the western edge of Siberia. The trip was led by Igor Dyatlov and was planned as a Category 3 skiing trek, the most difficult classification in the sport. On the second day of the journey, one of the hikers, Yuri Yurin, was forced to turn back because of crippling sciatica pain. He certainly didn't know it at the time, but this twist of fate would leave Yuri as the only surviving member of the group. On February 1st, 6 days after they started out, the remaining members of the Dyatlov party pitched their tent on the slope of Dead Mountain. By the time the sun rose the following morning, they were all dead, their bodies strewn across the icy terrain. Their horrific deaths and the enigmatic circumstances surrounding them would ignite one of Russia's most enduring mysteries. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident and the theories behind the hikers' mysterious fates. Now, everyone on this trip was an experienced hiker and skier, so when they missed their initial return dates, authorities weren't that concerned about their well-being. After all, trekking through the Ural Mountains in the winter is almost guaranteed to have a few complications. But when another week passed with no word from the hikers, authorities finally launched a search party. But there was a small issue. The exact path the Dyatlov party was set to take was not known to the authorities. The documentation had either been lost or was never filed properly. And so the search party went 6 days before they finally found evidence of the hikers. Two members of the search team discovered the party's tent pitched on the slope of Peak 1079. The entrance to the tent had collapsed, so the two men cut their way inside with an ice axe they found discarded in the snow. Everything in the tent was as it should be, with the gear and food stowed around the perimeter of the tent. The hikers' ski boots were lined up along one wall. There was even a plate of meat and a frozen cup of cocoa on the floor. By all appearances, the hikers had stepped out momentarily and could return at any second. On the far side of the tent, the men discovered something peculiar, however. Someone or something had cut a large opening in the tent. When the men stepped out, they discovered the footprints of several people. Ominously, the prints were made by stocking feet, or in some cases, by bare feet. If these prints were made by the Dyatlov party, very few of them were wearing proper footwear for the weather. The prints disappeared a short distance from the tent, and there was no further sign of the missing hikers. The entire search party returned the following day, and that is when the first two bodies were discovered. Grunge and Doroshenko were found under a thin layer of snow nearly a mile from the tent. They were lying near what appeared to be the remnants of a small fire, and strangely, both men were dressed only in their underwear. The bodies of three more hikers, Kolmogrova, Slobodin, and the group's leader Dyatlov, were found at intervals in a line leading back up the slope. By all appearances, the trio had been trying to make their way back to the tent when they perished. Though they were better dressed than Krivonoshenko and Doroshenko, these three were also severely underdressed for the weather. All 5 hikers were found to have died from hypothermia. After the discovery of the bodies, a legal investigation was immediately launched into the cause of their deaths. But it would be another 2 months before the last 4 hikers were found. And it's with the discovery of their bodies that things start to get really bizarre. Alexander Kolyvatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignot, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Lyudmila Dubnina were found in a ravine buried under more than 13 feet of snow. As a whole, this group was much better dressed for the weather, with many of them wearing multiple layers and even boots. One member even had a camera around his neck. It is theorized that they may have been outside when the terrible event that scared them into the freezing night occurred. But it was the state of their bodies that most puzzled investigators. Like the other hikers, Kolyvatov's cause of death was determined to be hypothermia, but his autopsy also reports an injury to the back of his head and a deformed neck. Thibault-Brignot had suffered a multi-splintered skull fracture, a wound that would have rendered him unconscious almost instantly and ultimately killed him. Semyon Zolotaryov had an open head wound, 5 broken ribs, and internal bleeding, and Lyudmila Dubnina had 10 broken ribs, one of which had punctured her heart. These were blunt force trauma injuries, as though the hikers had been in a car wreck. Several of the bodies were missing parts of their flesh as well, like eyes, nose, and lips. And the condition of these bodies weren't the only troubling facts to turn up in the case. Clothing on 2 of the 9 hikers had tested positive for radiation contamination, and witnesses, including the local Mansi people and another group of hikers who had camped 30 miles to the south, reported seeing glowing spheres or fireballs in the sky on the night the hikers were thought to have died.
Вверху, в небе, я увидел какое-то светлое пятно в виде шара округлого.
But investigators abruptly closed the case a month after the last 4 hikers were found. The case files were then sent away to a secret location, and hikers and skiers were banned from the area for 3 years. The official conclusion to the case was that the 9 had died from an overwhelming force, which the hikers were not able to overcome. This vague conclusion was obviously not a satisfactory answer for the families of the hikers, nor for the many sleuths who would dig into the case in the years to come. And given that this was the height of Cold War Russia, many began to suspect a government cover-up. So what really happened to the hikers? Well, the theories are innumerable, running the gamut from an alien encounter to a CIA sting operation. But for this video, we'll be looking at some of the more plausible theories, though that's not to say some aren't mildly bizarre. Theory number 1. Man versus beast. Now, given the damage to the tent, the panic that seemed to overcome the hikers, and the violent nature of some of their deaths, investigators looked into the theory that the hikers had encountered a deadly beast. The most likely culprit in this scenario would be the brown bears who are known to live in the region. Though far from common, brown bears are known to have attacked humans. The biggest caveat to this theory, however, is that at the time of this incident, brown bears would be hibernating. Some theorists point out that if a brown bear woke up prematurely or had not yet gone into hibernation, it would likely have been close to starving, thus giving the bear a motive to come after 9 hapless hikers in the dead of winter. Another related and certainly more bizarre theory is that the hikers encountered another kind of large beast, the Yeti. This theory is largely supported by a single blurry photograph, the last photo taken by Thibaut Brignol. Proponents of this theory claim that this photo shows a 10-foot hulking creature sizing up his prey, but others argue that this more closely resembles a hiker stepping out of the woods after answering the call of nature. But the fact is that there was no evidence around the camp of a large creature, fabled or otherwise. And while both of these beasts would certainly be capable of breaking ribs and crushing skulls, there were no external wounds to the bodies that would demonstrate a large animal attack, nor evidence that any of the hikers had been consumed by a large animal. The beast theory stands on very wobbly legs, and it's not widely considered a feasible explanation for the demise of the hikers. But what about the possibility that the hikers encountered another ancient enemy of man, other men? Man versus man. Another theory is that the hikers had been attacked by other people, and this is one of the theories that the Russian investigators initially looked into. The prime suspects here were the Mansi, a group of indigenous people who lived in the region. There was speculation that the Mansi may have attacked the group for encroaching on their hunting grounds, or grounds that some may have considered sacred. But the Mansi are a peaceful people, and they were known to have welcomed hikers that came into their villages. Several of the Mansi were also heavily involved in the search for the missing hikers. This theory was dismissed very early on by investigators in the case.
Говорит о том, что манси причастны к гибели дятловцев, не знает этот народ.
But what if there was another group of people in the area? A group with a motive to kill anyone they encountered? Well, as it turns out, there was. Maybe. Decades after the Dyatlov incident took place, it was revealed that the Russian government had a secret prisoner camp, also known as a gulag, in the area. It's theorized that if prisoners had escaped the camp in the winter of '59 and come across the Dyatlov party, they would have had several reasons to kill them. For one, the prisoners would not want to risk being reported to authorities. For another, given the remoteness of the camp, hikers' food and supplies would be vital in ensuring the prisoner's survival. But prison records at the time did not show that anyone escaped the camp. And while it would certainly be an open question as to whether or not the Soviet government at the time would be completely transparent in the record keeping, there were no signs of anyone other than the 9 hikers in the camp, and no food or supplies were found to be missing. But what if the attackers were professionals and they had worked specifically to cover up their presence at the camp? And that brings us to the next theory. Man versus government. As we mentioned earlier, there were reports of glowing orbs or fireballs in the sky on the night the hikers perished. The final image in Krivonashenko's camera even seems to capture these mysterious objects. And so one of the more popular theories is that the Dyatlov group was simply at the wrong place at the wrong time and were caught in the fallout from a secret government weapons test. This was the height of the Cold War after all, and the Russian government was no doubt involved in such testing. And proponents of this theory have put forth several likely candidates for the orbs in the night sky. The testing of parachute mines, for example, could account for the severe injuries sustained by some of the group. The concussion from a large explosion could break bones without leaving any external sign of injury. A misfired nuclear weapon could account for the radiation found on some of the hikers' clothing. And the explosions from such weapons, or the noxious fuel from a misfired rocket, could certainly have been enough to send the hikers scrambling from their tent into the cold without any thought to what they were wearing. This is in fact what Yuri Yurdin, the group's only survivor, believes happened. The sudden closing of the case by Russian officials and the secrecy that followed also lends credence to this theory.
Officials involved basically tried to sweep this entire thing under the rug, trying to make it look like some unfortunate accident.
And for those theorists who are even more conspiratorial in their thinking, the Russian government may have gone beyond merely covering up the deaths, but in fact been responsible for them. The thinking goes that if the hikers witnessed the weapons test so secret that the Russians didn't want to risk news of it getting out to the public, the hikers may have been eliminated by the KGB or the Russian army. An attack by special forces could explain the head trauma and broken ribs. Some believe the hikers could even have been tied to trees until they succumbed to the cold, and then their bodies arranged to look like a horrific accident. All signs of the attackers were then either erased or covered up by Russian officials. No less a figure than Boris Yeltsin himself, the future Russian president, looked into this theory as he rose through Communist Party ranks. During a meeting with the first investigator on the Dyatlov case, Vladimir Kureteyev reportedly told Yeltsin, "I think it was murder, and not a usual murder."
Весь мой опыт работы эксперта-криминалиста он говорит о том, что это не несчастный случай, это убийство.
But what they wrote when they closed the criminal case was true. They were killed by an overwhelming force. There are, of course, a few holes in this theory as well, including the fact that a faulty nuclear weapon would likely have left radiation on more than just 2 of the hikers, and that there are no clear records to indicate that any kind of weapons testing occurred in the area even 60 years later. On the other hand, the mere fact that the clothing was tested for radiation at all seems to lend this theory some credence. Why test the clothing if the cause of death was simply a natural occurrence? And that leads us to another set of theories. Could the hikers' deaths have been caused by nothing more than an ill-tempered Mother Nature? Man versus nature. There are 2 theories in this category that seem to carry the most credence. The first, that an avalanche was the cause of the disaster, has been around since the discovery of the tent in 1959. Now, certainly setting up camp on a snow-covered slope would bring about this risk, but the angle of the slope where the Dyatlov party set up their tent did not meet the minimum slope thought necessary for a traditional avalanche. Furthermore, there was no evidence of an avalanche in the area when the search party arrived on the scene, and the tent itself was not buried under the snow as one would expect if an avalanche had occurred. More recently, however, investigators and scientists have theorized that the hikers were victims not of a traditional avalanche, but something called a slab avalanche. To put it simply, a slab avalanche occurs when snow accumulates on a thin, weak layer of ice and slides down the slope as a cohesive unit. Though they carry a smaller volume of snow and can occur on a gentler slope than a traditional avalanche, given the right conditions, such an avalanche can bring the weight and force of a speeding vehicle. The occurrence of a slab avalanche could explain the traumatic injuries suffered by some of the party. This is, in fact, the theory that was put forward in 2019 after the Russians reopened the Dyatlov case. The lead investigator believes that the hikers cut into the side of the mountain to create a windbreak for the tent, weakening the snow layer and making conditions ripe for an avalanche. Snow continued to pile up on the slope above the campsite for several more hours, until the snow broke free and struck the tent, possibly causing trauma to the hikers. The fear of another larger avalanche then drove the hikers from their tent, and after getting lost, they died while trying to survive in the frigid temperatures. Critics of this theory point out that there have been more than 100 expeditions to the area since the Dyatlov Pass Incident occurred, and none have reported finding conditions for an avalanche on the slope. Nor does this theory explain the presence of the radiated clothing. There's also the question of whether the critically injured hikers would have been able to get out of the tent, let alone move more than a mile down the mountain. The second, albeit more bizarre theory involving Mother Nature, is that the hikers were the hapless victims of a phenomenon known as infrasound. This is the theory most compellingly put forward by Donnie Eicher in his book Dead Mountain. On a scientific level, infrasound is a sound that occurs at frequencies too low for human hearing. Some studies have reported effects on humans like nausea and dread. In some cases, it's been shown to cause panic or fear. Natural events like earthquakes and avalanches are known to produce infrasound. In his book, Eicher posits that wind speeding over the dome of a nearby mountain produced infrasound on the night of February 1st. The Dyatlov party's tent is unfortunately directly in the path of these winds, and when the infrasound hits the tent, party panics and flees, completely unaware of why they are so desperate to get out of the tent. The panic drives them down the mountain, and by the time they are out of range of the infrasound, they've lost sight of the tent. They become separated either while they are fleeing or shortly afterward, and unable to make their way back to the tent, they succumb to the cold. 4 of the hikers stumble over a precipice in the darkness, seriously wounding themselves on the rocks below. They die in the ravine and are covered in snow in the weeks before they are found. Now, like all the other theories, this one has its own holes, and as it relies on a loosely understood phenomenon, it's not widely accepted. Frankly, none of these theories seems to be able to answer all of the questions of the case. But there is one theory that has gained traction in recent years, which might come the closest. It's simply referred to as the everything theory. The idea is that the Dyatlov hikers were in the wrong place at the wrong time. A Russian military weapons test occurred very close to the camp. The resulting concussion from the explosion injured some of the hikers and showered others in radiation. It may even have caused a small avalanche to fall onto the tent. The hikers then fled in a panic and, unable to find their way back to the tent, succumbed to the cold. The best-dressed hikers had the wherewithal to dig a snow cave to protect themselves from the cold and wind, but they had the unfortunate luck of digging their cave over a small stream which had created a hollow ice tunnel. This ice tunnel collapsed beneath their weight and sent them crashing into the rocks below. The walls of snow crashed in behind them and buried them. Animals then scavenged the bodies before they were recovered by the rescue party, and the Russian government covered the whole thing up so as to protect the top-secret weapons testing. Any way you slice it, this is a mystery that will likely never be solved to everyone's complete satisfaction.